Welcome to the Federal TRIO Programs Training Module. This module discusses a brief history of TRIO programs, from the Civil Rights Movement to the time when 3 poverty initiatives became what we now know as TRIO. TRIO is not an acronym, but instead describes these 3 programs. Of course, there are 8 TRIO programs today, but this is the story of how it all began. Part 1. The Civil Rights Movement, Education as a Human Right. It's impossible to ignore that there was an air of indignation and a need for social reform at the midpoint of the 20th century. An all-encompassing system of white power had a psychological and mechanical stronghold across the United States. Jim Crow violence in the South and covert racism in the North were devastating for African Americans. Yet, it was primarily African Americans who fought back with equally steadfast tactics. Of course, the Civil Rights Movement was more than just a struggle for legal rights. It was a time to transform society through community social programs, direct action, boycotts, student protests, and even armed self-defense. The struggle initiated battles and discourse not only on issues of race, but also poverty and education. Education has always been at the forefront of civil rights. As a fundamental human right, education is crucial to promote personal freedom and self-development while simultaneously yielding economic benefits for everyone. During the civil rights struggle, education was imperative for upward mobility at a time when African Americans lived in the poorest neighborhoods, held the worst paid jobs, and could only afford the most basic facilities, including the worst financed schools. These issues were intensified in the southern states, where the general belief was that an educated African American was a threat to society, and blacks were not intelligent enough to deserve an education. Jim Crow laws cast a dark shadow over the southern states, and equal opportunity became nearly impossible for African Americans. Gary Orfield, co-director at the Harvard Civil Rights Project and among the nation's leading experts on desegregation, noted that the fight for equal education did not arise because anyone believed that there was something magical about sitting next to whites in a classroom. It was, however, based on a belief that the dominant group would keep control of the most successful schools and that the only way to get the full range of opportunities for a minority child was to get access to those schools. This issue of civil rights and education drew national and international attention following the events at Little Rock's Central High School in 1957, after the U.S. Supreme Court in 1954 ruled unanimously in Brown v. Board of Education that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. 9 truly brave African American students attempted to integrate Central High School in Little Rock. The result was a white mob and major standoff between then-Governor Orville Faubus and federal troops who were reluctantly ordered by President Eisenhower to protect the students.
What about you, sir? Do you think the colored students will show up?
If I got anything to do with it, they won't show up. Well, I think it's a breaking point of the school integration. I just don't feel that they have a right to go to school.
It is easy to believe today that we are an enlightened society, free from problems of race, gender, or economic separation. But some of the most difficult lessons we learn are a result of individuals who push us through these divisive barriers. In September of 1957, 9 black school children, the eldest only 17, forced us through such a blockade. They sought a better education for themselves and the opportunity to pursue the American dream.
This is Central High School, Little Rock, Arkansas. Troops, which for nearly 3 weeks lined the sidewalk here in front of the high school under orders to keep the colored students out, have been replaced now. And their orders to comply with the law, which means let the Negro students in if they come in.
We were Terrence Roberts, Jefferson Thomas, Thelma Mothershed, Elizabeth Eckford, Ernest Green, Carlotta Walls, Melba Patillo, Minnie Jean Brown, and Gloria Ray.
They became known as the Little Rock Nine. The 1954 Supreme Court ruling on Brown versus the Board of Education found segregation of schools unconstitutional. But as the Little Rock Nine approached the high school, segregationists swarmed the campus.
They got no business out here. This is our school, not theirs. They are their own.
As the violence escalated, one schoolgirl, Elizabeth Eckford, was threatened by an angry mob chanting, "Lynch her, lynch her." President Dwight Eisenhower intervened in Little Rock and set a precedent for our nation as a whole.
Such an extreme situation has been created in Little Rock. This challenge must be met, and with such measures as will preserve to the people as a whole their lawfully protected rights in a climate permitting their free and fair exercise. In the present case, the troops are there pursuant to law, solely for the purpose of preventing interference with the orders of the court.
On September 25, 1957, the 101st Airborne Division and 10,000 National Guard troops escorted the Little Rock Nine as they walked bravely past screaming mobs and made their way to the classrooms of Little Rock Central High School.
Just got a report here on this end that the students are in.
Do you feel it's worth it going through this?
Yes, I do.
These 9 heroes were willing to step forward and in doing so altered the course of history.
Emerging at this time was also a new national awareness concerning poverty, which was widespread but hidden. Popular writings at the time, including Michael Harrington's book, The Other America, Poverty in the United States, which sold over 1 million copies, and Our Invisible Poor by Dwight MacDonald, asserted that poverty afflicted at least 1/3 of the American public. Powerful voices of the civil rights movement also highlighted the issue of poverty. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. strongly believed that the national government was compelled to lift those left behind by the capitalist structure, and said, "The contemporary tendency in our society is to base our distribution on scarcity, which has vanished, and to compress our abundance into the overfed mouths of the middle and upper classes until they gag with superfluity. If democracy is to have breadth of meaning, it is necessary to adjust this inequity. It is not only moral, but it is also intelligent. We are wasting and degrading human life by clinging to archaic thinking."
I'd like to use as a subject from which to speak this afternoon the other America. And I use this subject because there are literally 2 Americas. One America is beautiful for situation. And in a sense, this America is overflowing with the milk of prosperity and the honey of opportunity. This America is the habitat of millions of people who have food and material necessities for their bodies, and culture and education for their minds, and freedom and human dignity for their spirits. In this America, millions of people experience every day the opportunity of having life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in all of their dimensions. And in this America, millions of young people grow up in the sunlight of opportunity. But tragically and unfortunately, there is another America. And this other America has a daily ugliness about it that constantly transforms the buoyancy of hope into the fatigue of despair. In this America, millions of work-starved men walk the streets daily in search for jobs that do not exist. In this America, millions of people find themselves living in rat-infested, vermin-filled slums. In this America, people are poor by the millions, and they find themselves perishing on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. In a sense, the greatest tragedy of this other America is what it does to little children. Little children in this other America are forced to grow up with clouds of inferiority forming every day in their little mental skies. And as we look at this other America, we see it as an arena of blasted hopes and shattered dreams.
With popular unrest regarding economic inequality on the rise, the public began to shift its consensus. The scope and cost of poverty could no longer be ignored. Moving forward, poverty would be confronted on multiple fronts, including federal involvement in education, which had previously been the domain of state and local governments. Part 2. Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. Federal Funding for the Poor. President John F. Kennedy wanted to study the crisis of poverty and take action. In 1961, he appointed economic populist Walter Heller to chair the White House Council of Economic Advisers, charged with offering the president economic policy advice. Heller suggested a major initiative he called the War on Poverty, focused on increasing the government's role in education and healthcare as strategies to reduce poverty. Following Kennedy's assassination, succeeding President Lyndon Johnson assured the nation that he would carry on the policies of Kennedy. With Walter Heller's support, Johnson bought into new economic strategies to tackle national issues of inequity and set forth a set of domestic programs he called the Great Society. The goal was to eliminate poverty and racial injustice by creating new major spending programs that addressed education, medical care, and urban issues. In the eyes of some, Johnson's undertaking was an expression of regret for his past voting record as a Texas congressman and senator. Though he understood the link between racism and poverty as a matter of political expediency, Johnson voted against civil rights measures multiple times. Many of his rationalizations trotted a standard Southern justification that he was not against blacks' rights, but for states' rights. It was often difficult to tell where Johnson stood on civil rights. When white Texans alleged Johnson was endorsing a civil rights bill in 1957, he replied that he was strongly and irrevocably opposed to forced integration of the races. However, Johnson's Southern political correctness did not always match his actions. Johnson grew up in poor Texas Hill Country and was a school teacher for the children of poor migrant workers. Behind the scenes, he was working on small developments for exploited people in his Texas district and was one of only 3 Southern politicians who refused to sign the Southern Manifesto in protest of Brown versus Board of Education. There were, more or less, 7 major program areas under Johnson's Great Society. The War on Poverty, which included 40 programs that were intended to eliminate poverty by improving living conditions and enabling people to lift themselves out of the cycle of poverty. There were 60 separate bills that provided for new and better equipped classrooms, minority scholarships, and low-interest student loans. Medicare and Medicaid was also created, which guaranteed health care to every American over 65. Measures and bills introduced to reclaim our heritage of clean air and water. A national endowment for the arts and the humanities was created with the philosophy that artists, performers, and writers were a priceless part of our heritage and deserve support. There was a Job Corps that provided enabling skills for young men and women. And finally, Head Start, a program for 4 and 5-year-old children from disadvantaged families that gave them a chance to start school on an even basis with other youngsters. During President Johnson's time in office, dozens of laws were passed to promote the Great Society, including but not limited to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act of 1965, Social Security Amendments of 1965, Child Nutrition Act of 1966, and the Higher Education Act of 1965. As part of the Great Society, President Johnson embraced Walter Heller's economic plan and declared a war on poverty during his first State of the Union address on January 8, 1964. Johnson quickly set up a task force to, as he put it, forever eliminate poverty from the richest nation on earth.
Unfortunately, many Americans live on the of hope. Some because of their poverty, and some because of their color, and all too many because of both. Our task is to help replace their despair with opportunity. And this administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America. And I urge this Congress and all Americans to join with me in that effort.
During the State of the Union address, President Johnson said no single piece of legislation, however, is going to suffice. The War on Poverty was an unofficial name given to a multitude of legislative aims President Johnson introduced.
The American nation is the most abundant, the most prosperous the world has ever seen. But the paradox is this, that in the midst of plenty, there exists poverty. Poverty is a great enemy of the American dream, a grinding enemy that hits at the heart of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, an enemy with which this nation is at war. And what does this have to do with you? Well, these are your times, and this is your country, these, your countrymen. The war on poverty is your war. To be poor is to be fenced in, to live out your life trapped in a prison. You know there's a better world outside, but somehow it doesn't belong to you. If only someone would come into your world and help tear the fences down.
In January of 1964, Johnson asked Sergeant Shriver, a political organizer and Kennedy family member, to develop a bill to wage the poverty war. In 6 weeks, Shriver's team introduced legislation titled the Economic Opportunity Act. The bill was presented to Congress in March of 1964 and debated along partisan lines. The idea was not the distribution of wealth, but to provide poor people with the means to support themselves. One of the main provisions of the law allowed the government to bypass the states and send funds directly to local agencies, which strategically sidestepped southern states that did not cooperate with the law, since those states already had a horrific track record of voting rights. The Economic Opportunity Act was passed and signed into law on August 20th, 1964. The law established the Office of Economic Opportunity, or OEO, to administer 11 major poverty initiatives, and Sergeant Shriver was appointed national director. The Office of Economic Opportunity, OEO, under Sergeant Shriver had 11 initiatives, including a Job Corps, intended to help young people ages 16 through 24 improve the quality and satisfaction of their lives through vocational and academic training. A Neighborhood Youth Corps, providing work and training for young people from impoverished families and neighborhoods. Work Study, to provide grants to colleges and universities for part-time employment for students from low-income families. Urban and Rural Community Action, which provided funds to nonprofit agencies to progress towards the elimination of poverty. Adult Basic Education, providing funds to support those with the inability to read and write English and offer instruction to move towards employment. Voluntary Assistance for Needy Children, a center to encourage volunteerism for children in poverty. Loans to rural families not exceeding $2,500, intended to assist low-income rural families to permanently increase their income. Assistance for migrant agricultural workers and their families with basic needs. Investment incentives and loans not in excess of $25,000 to increase small business. Volunteers in Service to America, or VISTA, which recruits, selects, trains, and refers volunteers to agencies that perform duties to combat poverty. And a Demonstration and Research Office to fund experimental, pilot, and demonstration projects that expand opportunities for work experience and needed training for people in poverty. It was the 11th initiative, the Demonstration and Research Office, that set off the TRIO movement. Though not yet called TRIO, one of the first demonstration programs was aimed at identifying high school students from low-income backgrounds who were underachieving and motivate and prepare them for college. It was a Washington insider and a member of the Kennedy Inner Circle, Stanley Sellet, who infused ideas from other experimental pre-college initiatives and led the development of a small program called Upward Bound. In the end, it was Stanley Sellet who was considered the mastermind of Upward Bound programs. The first Upward Bound programs had a 2-person staff in the Office of Economic Opportunity, who set policy and a private contractor who processed applications and monitored progress. 17 pilot programs began in 1965 and served 2,061 students. Several of the programs existed before 1965, but operated under a different name and administration. They were started by nonprofit organizations such as Educational Services, Inc., and funded by those organizations or private philanthropies such as Ford, Rockefeller, and Carnegie Foundations. In 1965, the Office of Education incorporated many of these existing programs under the rubric of Upward Bound and created additional programs. The first summer of Upward Bound pilot programs were housed at Dillard University, Fisk, Howard U, Texas Southern University, Morehouse, Webster, the University of Ozarks, Columbia, NYU, Tennessee State University, Western Washington State University, Ripon College, University of Oregon, Lemoyne College in Syracuse, New York, New Mexico Highlands University, Florida A&M, and Independent Schools Talent Search programs in Boston, Massachusetts. Approximately 80% of Upward Bound students from the first cohort were admitted to college in the fall of 1965, and 69% of those graduated. Part 3. Higher Education Act of 1965. Federal Funding for Education. After the passing of the 1964 Economic Opportunity Act, President Johnson articulated the need for more opportunity and access to higher education for lower and middle-income families, program assistance for small and less developed colleges, additional and improved library resources at higher education institutions, and utilization of college and university resources to help deal with national problems like poverty and community development. While speaking at Southwest Texas State on November 8, 1965, President Johnson remarked, "In a very few moments, I will put my signature on the Higher Education Act of 1965. The President's signature upon this legislation passed by this Congress will swing open a new door for the young people of America. For them and for this entire land of ours, it is the most important door that we will ever open, the door to education."
This is a proud moment in my life. Proud to have a part in the beginning that this bill provides. Because here, a great deal began for me some 38 years ago on this campus. It was here, these surroundings, that I first understood the deeper meaning of the Bible's promise that ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. Here the seeds were planted from which grew my firm conviction that for the individual, education is the path to achievement and fulfillment. And for the nation, it is a path to society that is not only free but civilized. And for the world, it is the path to peace. For it is education that places reason over force.
The Higher Education Act of 1965 was meant to tackle the issues of inequity in higher education and, quote, strengthen the educational resources of our colleges and universities and to provide financial assistance for students in post-secondary and higher education. It increased federal money given to universities, created scholarships and low-interest loans for students, otherwise known as federal financial aid, and established a national teachers corps. The Higher Education Act of 1965 included 6 titles. Title I, providing funding for extension and continuing education programs. Title II allocates money to enhance library collections. Title III, provisions for strengthening developing institutions. Title IV provided student assistance through scholarships, low-interest loans, and work-study programs. Title V, provisions for improving the quality of teaching. And Title VI, provisions for improving undergraduate instruction. Much of the funding for the Higher Education Act would be appropriated to low-income students, which was a first for the federal government, who had never before specified low-income students in federal spending. Previously, higher education in the United States was an institution for upper-income and almost exclusively privileged whites, with the exception of historically black colleges. It was a function of maintaining the status quo between white and black, rich and poor. Two Washington insiders from the Office of Education, or OE, James Moore and Samuel Halperin, both close to the Johnson administration, helped develop the Higher Education Act. Sam Halperin was credited as an architect of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, signed by President Lyndon Johnson to provide comprehensive federal aid to public schools. The act included the Title I provision, which has provided billions of federal dollars to help educate poor children. Dr. Halperin also worked to shepherd the 1965 Higher Education Act, which helped give college students access to many new resources for financial aid. James Moore administered national defense student loans under the National Defense Education Act of 1958, which provided loans to low-income students and grew out of the quote-unquote Red Scare and fear that the USSR schools were superior to American schools, particularly following the successful Soviet launch of the Sputnik satellite on October 4, 1957. Due to the GI Bill and other legislation, higher education enrollment in the United States would surge in the 1960s. The second of the trio programs, Contracts to Encourage the Full Utilization of Educational Talent, later called Talent Search, emerged when James Moore and Sam Halperin inserted language into Section 408 of the Higher Education Act, which helped identify qualified low-income students for post-secondary education, publicizing financial aid and encourage high school and college dropouts to re-enter college. This section of the bill was also intended to promote high school counselors and colleges about money available through Educational Opportunity Grants, or EOGs, and how to access those funds. But the 17-line section added to the bill was vague, which led to early problems with talent search and EOG funds. Many funds went unawarded because higher education did not enroll low-income students. At other institutions, funds were abused when they were used to support privileged students rather than serve those who the funds were intended for, the disadvantaged. In time, many of those challenges were met, and the program was renamed Education Talent Search. The Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 and the Higher Education Act of 1965 set TRIO programs in motion, starting with Upward Bound and later adding Educational Talent Search. The legislation was the most radical reform of higher education in United States history, effectively creating the current-day federal financial aid system and programs, like TRIO, responsible for providing the support necessary for low-income students to access higher education and succeed. Part 4. 1968 Reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. 2 programs become 3. The poverty rate had been declining when the War on Poverty was launched in 1964. It fell from 22.4% in 1959 to 19% in 1964. The poverty rate declined further after the implementation of the War on Poverty, hitting a low point of 11.1% in 1973. This was one of the largest reductions in the poverty rate in American history. However, the War on Poverty was debated from the start and still debated today. Many on the right feel that the laws enacted had an impact on the economy because of their interventionist nature. They also felt there was a backlash among white Americans while sticking the middle class with the bill for services to the poor. Those on the left felt that there was not enough done and were angered by spending towards the Vietnam War, which they believed devastated many of the gains made by the War on Poverty. Scrutiny of the 1964 Economic Opportunity Act by Republicans came in 1966. They believed the programs were wasteful and inefficient, though evaluation of the programs was mostly positive but disputably inconclusive. After 4 years had passed, the first set of amendments to the act were passed in 1968. An upward bound was removed from the Office of Economic Opportunity, or OEO, and transferred to the Office of Education, OE, a relatively minor bureau in the cabinet-level Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. This change was led mainly by Congresswoman Edith Green of Oregon, a staunch supporter of women's rights, but increasingly disenchanted with liberal agendas and the expansive role of the federal government. Congresswoman Green felt President Johnson's programs did not improve the lives of those in poverty and fought to shift responsibilities to state and local governments. Under President Nixon, much of the poverty funding was diverted to support the war in Vietnam. The act was essentially repealed in 1981 during the Reagan administration, but many pieces of the Economic Opportunity Act were reconfigured and shifted to other offices, including Upward Bound. The Higher Education Act of 1965 was reauthorized in 1968, 71, 72, 76, 80, 86, and so on. Before each reauthorization, Congress amends additional programs, changes the language and policies of existing programs, or makes other changes. One of the most significant reauthorizations of the Higher Education Act occurred in 1968, the same time Upward Bound was transferred out of the Office of Economic Opportunity to the Office of Education. Upward Bound then joined Educational Talent Search and a new program called Special Services for Disadvantaged Students, or SSDS. The new program was necessary due to the influx of disadvantaged students into higher education. Upward Bound and Talent Search helped to open the door to college for low-income students, but colleges and universities still had little to no support systems for the same students once they arrived on campus. In order for institutions of higher education to receive Educational Opportunity Grants, or EOGs, which put additional funds on their balance sheets, they needed to enroll low-income students. It was obviously an expectation that these same institutions prepare students, who often came to campus with academic deficits, then retain and graduate them. A provision in the reauthorization also required that 10% of funds be used for quote-unquote physically disabled students, which was the first time this population was recognized in education legislation. Funding for services for disadvantaged students began in 1970. There were 121 original programs nationwide. In time, Services for Disadvantaged Students was renamed Student Support Services, or SSS. The process of moving Upward Bound from the Office of Economic Opportunity to the Office of Education was not without hiccups, with key officials in both offices cajoling over bureaucratic details and personal indifferences. Very few original staff remained. Regardless, with Upward Bound, contracts to encourage the full utilization of educational talent, or Talent Search, and Services for Disadvantaged Students, SSS, in place at the Office of Education, TRIO, a title meaning 3 programs, was born.